Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. I am Daniela Diogen, and I support small businesses and entrepreneurs at the Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership. The Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership is a nonprofit organization. It's a public-private nonprofit organization founded 20 years ago with the mission to promote business opportunities in the district through business retention, expansion, and attraction initiatives. In partnership with the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, we support businesses and entrepreneurs looking to open, expand, or invest in DC. On behalf of the Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership and our partners at the D.C. Bono Center, the Department of Small and Local Business Development, and the Anacostia Economic Development Center, I want to welcome you all to our D.C. Biz Chat on what to know when deciding to lease a commercial space. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the D.C. Health Link for their support and contribution to the publication. I would like to acknowledge Capital One and the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development. Capital One has been a longtime partner of the DC Biz Chat, providing support to allow us to put together these types of programs together. Also, the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development has been the partnership's primary partner for the past 20 years, and we work together to support the business community from startups to established businesses looking to invest in our communities. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on our website and on our YouTube channel in a few weeks. When it becomes available, please feel free to share with your network. Please utilize the chat window to share your comments and thoughts. If you have any questions for our speaker, please utilize the Q&A. Closed captioning is available for today's session, so please feel free to take advantage of that. A reminder to everyone, at the Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership, we value everyone's opinion and respect diversity in thought, so please do the same and be respectful of each other while using the chat window. As part of today's webinar, our partners have agreed to offer one-on-one technical assistance to new and existing tenants that are looking to rent, renegotiate, or exit a lease. Please reach out to us if you're interested in business counseling as it relates to this subject matter. For those of you joining us today for the first time, brief history about the DC Biz Chat. The DC Biz Chat series is the Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership's signature workshop series that supports local businesses by providing expert advice, resources, and practical solutions. We bring together thought leaders and local businesses who are able to share their expertise with us. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Along with today's Biz Chat, we are excited and proud to release the comprehensive commercial leasing guide. Thank you to our partners at the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, Ghoston and Stalls, DC Bono Center, and the Department of Small and Local Business Development for providing subject matter expertise and guidance to make this happen. Next slide. The toolkit is meant to supplement information you would receive today for our speaker and should also help provide guidance to businesses looking to lease a commercial space. The toolkit is categorized in 4 sections. The first section provides a step-by-step overview of the leasing process prior to signing a commercial lease. The second section, or the next section, navigates what you need to know when you begin thinking about altering a space to meet your demands. The third section explores what happens when you decide to end or default on a lease. The final section provides any other additional information as well as resources on organizations that offer assistance to businesses at various leasing phases. The toolkit will be available on our website for you to download, so please check it out and let us know if you have any questions. Should you need assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Director Whitfield for a few comments. She is the Director of the Department of Small and Local Business Development, as well as serves on the partnership's board of directors. Thank you, Director, for your long-time support of the partnership. Over to you, Director Whitfield.
Thank you, Daniela. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Daniela. I want to thank the partnership and the DC Pro Bono Bar for for partnering with us on this really exciting topic. When you start your business and you get to this next level where you think it is time to maybe go into your own space, the idea of having a brick and mortar location is exciting and a little bit daunting. And it's really important to make sure that you are thinking through all of the intricacies and the practical pieces. And sometimes, especially when you're doing a lease, and I've signed, quite a few leases in my time, you are told something like, oh, these are the things that we always have, or these are the pieces that never change, or these are the CAM fees, or these are the little built-in costs. And the thing that's going to be exciting, I think, about today's presentation, and I want to really thank Mark Jackson from Goulston and Stores, demystifying the pieces of commercial leases. Commercial leases are different than residential leases in so many ways, and understanding what those obligations are is empowering for our small businesses. And one of the things that we want to do in these biz chats and in these seminars is make sure that when you are taking those next steps, that you have the tools and the information to make those informed decisions. Small businesses are really good at the things we do, but we need that information and that insight to make those steps at the things that we don't necessarily do. And we are not always. I was a cupcake baker. I was an affordable housing developer at one point. I was not necessarily a commercial leasing expert until I had signed, I think, my third lease maybe. And then I started thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe we can change this, or maybe we can't change that. So let me just say again, thank you to our partners who are coming together to put this information out. This is the sort of thing you might want to, I'm glad you're participating, but again, it's important to know that these resources and other resources are available on the YouTube channels, and that's why we record this, so that when you want to say, well, what was that piece of information that was said? Let me go back and listen to this again. These resources are here because we want people to have that information. We have other resources available. Another really important session that we did in partnership with the DC Pro Bono Center that I want to just highlight, and Daryl Maxwell is a real champion for helping people get the legal advice they need, was the Knowing Your Rights and I think that's another one that's on our website channel. So I'm going to stop talking now and just say, again, thank you to our partners. Thank you to the partnership. Thank you to AEDC. Thank you to the Pro Bono Law Center. Thank you to everyone that's taking the time out of your busy days to get informed about these important information, so that we can make sure that when you make those steps, you're doing it from an informed position and you're getting yourself into the leases that serve you and put you in the right position to move your business forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Whitfield. Now, obviously, Director Daryl Maxwell of the DC Bar Pro Bono Center couldn't join us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Christine Kulumani from the DC Bar Pro Bono Center for some opening remarks. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you, Daniela. I'm Christine, and I am a staff attorney in the Pro Bono Center's nonprofit and small business legal assistance programs. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we provide legal assistance to community nonprofits and small businesses in DC. One of the topics that we see all the time, it's really evergreen, is commercial leases. As small businesses are started, as they grow, as they evolve, as they shut down, as they shift, commercial leases are at the core of the operations for many small businesses. We so appreciate the partnership with all of our different organizations today to bring this guide together and this presentation. And a huge, huge thank you to Mark and Jen and the team at Golston & Stores for distilling this incredibly valuable and sometimes super complicated information into a wonderful resource that is going to help your small business understand what a commercial lease is, what the typical process looks like, and help spot red flags. That said, these fantastic resources are only a start. The Pro Bono Center encourages you, if you have questions about your situation, your commercial lease, would like to have a commercial lease reviewed one-on-one by an attorney for free before you sign it, ideally, you are welcome to come to us. You can find our resources, including the link to sign up for a one-on-one session, at lawhelp.org/NPSB. lawhelp.org/DC/NPSB. And please go on there, explore the resources, and take advantage of all of these other non-legal resources as well. Ask us questions. That is what we are here for. And do not be intimidated by the wealth of information that you are going to get today. A commercial lease does not have to be scary. You have friends and support to help you get through that. And with that, I will be quiet.
Thank you, Christine. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mark Jackson. He's the director of the Golston & Stores and our speaker for today. I would have him introduce himself and dive into the topic of discussion. Mark, over to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Jackson with the law firm of Golston & Stores, joined today by my colleague, Jennifer Biscayre, who will be assisting in the presentation. Jen, say hi.
Hello, everyone.
Jen's down in Charlottesville today. Golston is a AmLaw 200 law firm. We have offices in Boston, New York, and DC. Boston is our home office. We have almost 300 lawyers. We have one of the largest and most sophisticated real estate practices in the United States. We're experts in all aspects of transactional real estate, including acquisitions, dispositions, joint venture work, financing, land and project development, and of course, germane to this discussion, leasing. Our leasing practice handles all types of transactions in all types of asset classes: office headquarters, lab space, build-to-suit leases, industrial, single user build-to-suit transactions, big box leases, really every type of lease transaction that you are interested in, have heard of. We have a deep level of experience with them. On a personal level, I have over 35 years of experience in transactional real estate and particularly leasing. I do both. I do work for both landlords and tenants, so I see all sides of the process. Just for kind of a sample of what I'm currently working on, I do a lot of retail work, so I'm working on a warehouse club lease, a national discount department store lease. I have a big deal with a national grocery store. I have office leases of various sizes that I handle for landlords. And right now I'm handling 4 or 5 different office leases of varying sizes for different tenants. Golston & Stores is really pleased to work with the District of Columbia, DMPED, and particularly the Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership and the D.C. Pro Bono Center on this project. We hope the Toolkit will provide you and others like you with the resources to better understand the leasing process and make good decisions with respect to your real estate needs. Okay, with that being said, let's get started. First and foremost, even before we get to the first steps, the first thing to know is that a lease is a binding contract. It is a unique animal. It can be short and can be long, but it has serious consequences for you and for your business. Generally speaking, most leases that you're going to see, particularly from institutional landlords, which are the bulk of the landlords in the DC market, they're long and they are drafted to protect the landlord. And of course, you know, that means they don't have terms that are not necessarily favorable to you. The landlord wants you as a tenant, but it's not your friend. So you've got typically over 50 pages plus exhibits of detailed terms and conditions, which can have a significant impact on your business, from a monetary standpoint and otherwise. We'll discuss some, but not all of the key issues and pitfalls today. And our goal is to, help you get the space that you want for the right price upon fair terms, which allow your business to grow and does not expose you to unacceptable risk. So first and foremost, from a risk standpoint, your first question really is, how are you going to operate? Are you going to be a sole proprietor and just go out there and run your business and sign your leases personally? Or are you going to, form a business entity? From our perspective, we always advise clients as a first step to form a business entity. It can be a simple limited liability company. It can be an S Corp. It can be a partnership. But forming a business entity, if you form it properly and capitalize it properly, will give you a vehicle that will protect your personal assets from creditor claims and potential third-party claims, such as what happens if there's a slip and fall on your property, which is not covered by insurance. All of those things can lead to serious claims and liabilities for which you could be personally liable if you don't have an entity. So we always suggest that you form a business entity if it's feasible. There are tax and other considerations, and what type of entity you form depends on a lot of things. So that's for another discussion, but we do suggest that. Also, as a first step, you're going to need a team. And there are a number of people that can provide a lot of really important and valuable services in connection with the leasing process. The person who on the front end is going to be your most helpful advocate is the real estate broker. There are just tons of really good real estate brokers in this town. They're all hungry for your business. Happily, you don't pay their fees most times. The landlord almost always is going to compensate your broker on a market basis. So there's really no downside to you in engaging a broker to represent your interests and to help you find the right real estate. Obviously, we think it's important for you to have legal counsel of some sort in connection with the leasing process. Again, the lease is a complicated document. It's not for the faint of hearted. Your broker has certainly some level of experience with many of the clauses, but more often than not, does not have and will not act as your counsel in that regard. So we do suggest that you have counsel of some sort to advise you. Depending on the type of space that you're leasing, for example, if you're not leasing a space that's sort of built out and ready to go, you will likely need an architect to help you, design the space to accommodate your business. And you will also need an insurance consultant. Very important. Your landlord is going to require that you have appropriate levels of insurance, and you absolutely should have appropriate levels of insurance to protect your business. And so once you have your team in place, you select your broker, you go out and you tour the sites. So let's move to the next slide, please. So when you go out looking for space, obviously location. You want to be in the location that's going to be best for your business. It's going to give you and many times the best visibility. The type of neighborhood you're in may or may not be important to you. If you have a restaurant and you may want to be near offices or apartments. If you're an office user, you may think that your employees will want access to various amenities. The newer buildings, they have fitness centers, they have roof decks, they sometimes have conference centers, which are very helpful to to small businesses, because you may not have the space in your physical in the four walls of your space to have a conference center. And some of the buildings have conference centers that are right there that you can use on a first come first serve basis. You effectively pay for that in part through your lease, but it's a really nice amenity that is really helpful for startup businesses. As they say, size matters in a lot of things, and that's certainly true with respect to real estate. But sometimes it's really hard to determine, what the size of your space is. This is particularly true with office space. While the government, when they lease space, really pays rent based on the usable area of the space, basically inside the kind of four walls of the space, office space really doesn't work that way most times. There is a concept of core factor or load factor, which will take your usable office space and turn it into rentable space, and you pay rent on the rentable space. So there is building rentable space and there's floor rentable areas or core areas. So for example, on your floor, your common corridors, your bathrooms, your telecom rooms, mechanical rooms, those constitute floor common area. All you get into your lease, sort of a pro rata portion of that space gets added to your rentable area. Same thing for building common areas. So lobbies, fitness centers, perhaps conference centers, you will be paying for a portion of that because your square footage is going to be artificially increased from the rentable to the usable. And it can be significant. You may have an add-on load factor that could be 20% or more in a particular building, and that can drive up your rent. So you need to understand what you're leasing, both from a rentable and a usable square footage basis. And you're probably going to want to have your architect working with you to determine how efficient the space is for you. There are a lot of reasons why a space, an office area, or retail for that matter, can be laid out in a manner that is either more or less efficient. Buildings, the placement of windows, columns, things like that can impact the design of your space, can leave you with areas that are sort of dead or really unusable. So it's really important for you to understand that. And again, your architect can help you to explore all of those issues. Last thing to consider is when you're thinking about your space needs, is really not just what you need today, but what do you envision you're going to need in the future? That is, do you think that you will need expansion rights, for example? And there are many ways that you can structure that. You can have fixed expansion rights. You can have options to lease space. You can have rights of first offer or rights of first refusal as adjacent space or space on other floors come up. So all those things you should take into account when you think about that, because the last thing you want to do is sign a 10-year lease for 3,000 square feet and end up needing 10,000 square feet, and you're kind of locked in. So you need to think a little more long-term than just what your immediate needs are, unless you're signing a very short-term lease. Also, in some cases, if you're signing a longer-term lease, you may be able to negotiate an option for contraction, which allows you, after a certain number of years, to perhaps give back some space to your landlord if your business hasn't grown in the manner that you're envisioning. The landlord is not going to just take it back for nothing, but it may be that after, this is an example, if you lease 8,000 square feet, after 5 years, maybe you can give back 3,000 square feet by paying the landlord some sort of an early termination fee with respect to that space. Those things are possible depending on the circumstances and the desirability of the space. Let's move to slide 3. Jen, I think you're going to talk a little bit about different types of rent structures.
Yes, thanks, Mark. So there are 3 basic categories of rent. The first is called base rent, which is also known as minimum rent. And as the name suggests, the minimum rent is the minimum amount that the tenant owes the landlord each month. This is often expressed as a per square foot number, which involves the square footage of your space and then the portion of square footage in any common area that's used by all of the tenants. And there either may be no increase in the minimum rent if it's a shorter lease period or smaller space, or there may be an annual percentage increase in the minimum rent, which is often around 2 to 3% every year. The second category of rent is additional rent, and this includes rent for items such as taxes, common area maintenance, or operating expenses, and utilities and insurance. And it's important here to pay attention to what capital expenses are included in common area maintenance expenses. If you have a shorter lease term, you should not be paying for long-term costs or investments that you won't be benefiting from. Or at the very least, these sorts of expenses should be amortized to reflect the utility that you will get out of them as a tenant.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk a little bit further later in the program about that in a little more detail. Yes, yeah. That's exactly right.
And one point of negotiation for additional rent is that you can try to limit increases in additional rent to a cap of around 4 to 6% per year. And the last category of rent, which is the 4th bullet here, is percentage rent, which applies only to retail leases. And this involves you sharing a percentage of your sales as additional rent with the landlord. So this will kick in after a certain amount of gross sales are met, and this amount is known as the break point. So if you never reach the break point, then you're not obligated to pay percentage rent.
Right, so your break point can either be a fixed number for sales, $1 million, 100,000, whatever it is, or you can have what's called a natural break point. And you determine a natural break point by taking the landlord's sharing percentage. Let's say it's 5%, 5% of gross sales over a natural break. That's sort of kind of how what we term it in the industry. So you would just, if your annual rent is $100,000, just take your annual rent divided by that percentage and you get to the natural break. So on $100,000, if the landlord sharing percentage is 5%, the break point is $2 million. So you keep your first 2 million, everything over 2 million, the landlord gets 5% off. So that's how a natural break works. The other thing about this slide, besides the basic levels of base rent and additional rent, there are a couple of different ways that leases, both office and lease, mostly office leases, but also retail leases can be structured. If you have a short-term lease, it's possible that your landlord may just charge you just a flat rent, and you're not going to pay any of these additional items. And that would be called a gross lease. So you pay your, whatever it is, $2,500 a month, maybe plus utilities, and that's it. You don't have to pay your pro rata share of taxes. You don't have to pay anything on kind of operating expenses. Again, that's more common in really short-term leases. Generally speaking, the landlords want in the longer term leases, they want a rent that's going to cover their risk of cost increases. And the best way that the landlords do that is through what's called a triple net lease, where generally speaking, in addition to the base rent, a tenant pays its pro rata share of landlord's cost of insurance, real estate taxes, and operating cost. Again, we'll get into the details later, but that's what the triple net component is referring to, generally speaking. Operating expenses, sometimes referred to as CAM, or common area expenses in a retail context, real estate taxes, and insurance. So if you have a triple net lease, and let's say you have 5,000 square feet in a 50,000 square foot building, you're going to pay 10% of all of those charges. A variant of a triple net lease is called a full service lease. And instead of paying 100% of all the landlord's charges, you're paying your pro rata share of those charges of increases in those charges in excess of the costs that are attributable to the base year. So your rent number will effectively include your pro rata share of the triple net charges for the first lease year, and thereafter you're only paying increases in those amounts. So your base year may be, if you're signing a lease today, you'll have a base year of 2022, and most likely if you move in. And so the real estate taxes, you don't pay anything on account of real estate taxes or operating expenses during your first year of occupancy, because they're effectively baked into the base rent. You pay only for increases. So if the increases are $3-4 a foot in the next year after the base year, that's what you pay your pro rata share of. Okay.
Can go to the next slide, please. So landlords typically require a security deposit, and the amount of the deposit will vary based on a range of considerations. One consideration is the amount of base rent. Another consideration is money that the landlord has spent to build out the space and complete the transaction. This will include items such as brokerage commissions, construction costs, construction allowances, free rent, and legal fees. And a final consideration is the creditworthiness of the business and the business's current financial condition. So if your business has little or no financial history, the landlord will likely charge a higher deposit. But one thing that you can negotiate is a reduction in which the landlord returns part of the deposit after a certain amount of time if your business proves to be successful. In addition to the amount of the deposit, there's also the form of the deposit, which can be cash or credit or both. A landlord may require that you submit a letter of credit instead of cash or in addition to cash. And this is a document through which the bank guarantees that it will pay the deposit if you default under the lease. Banks charge a fee for letters of credit and may also require collateral such as a mortgage. As far as getting the deposit back, the lease should require the landlord to refund the security deposit within 30 to 90 days of your vacating the space, so long as you leave the space in good condition and don't have any rent owed, of course. So in addition to the security deposit, the landlord may also require a guarantee, which means that even if you form a tenant entity, you'll have to make a personal guarantee as an individual. And you may also need to include your spouse on the guarantee as well. And this means that you are personally responsible to the landlord with respect to lease obligations. There are a few potential areas to negotiate with guarantees. One option is that you can try to limit the guarantee to a specified amount or a specified number of months in rent. Another option, similar to the reduction with the security deposit, you can reduce obligations over time as you prove your creditworthiness and net worth as a business.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just sort of kind of an example. Maybe you have one of the founders, one or more of the founders, signing a personal guarantee that is not capped at all for the first 3 lease years, and then after that, maybe the guarantee amount is limited to 1 or 2 years of rent plus cost of collection. 2 years after that, maybe it reduces more. Any number of ways to cut that. But again, the landlord is looking if the landlord is spending a lot of money on building out your space and paying commissions and giving you free rent, it wants to cover its investment. So these are very important issues from the landlord's perspective. Okay, I think we can go on to the next item, which again, talking about what the landlord is providing. One of the reasons that the landlord wants all these deposits and guarantees is because in this market, it is providing typically for longer term leases, a lot in the way of leasing concessions. Leasing concessions can take the form of free rent. So it may be that for the first 6 months, a year, right now I'm doing a lease, candidly, a longer term lease where there is 2 years of free rent where the tenant is paying no rent at all. And the landlord is kind of baking that into the rent over the life of the lease. That is a big lease concession. Obviously, those kinds of things are great for startup businesses, but you do end up paying for them. Though there are typically construction allowances, which allow to give the tenant money to help cover the cost of building out the space. Again, those can be significant. Some leases, and we're seeing a lot more of this these days, allow tenants to take a portion of the free rent allowance and perhaps convert it to additional construction allowances if their construction costs increase. And similarly, there may be situations where you are able to take unused portions of your construction allowance and convert that to free rent. And then again, the other lease consideration is that the landlord is almost always paying the fee to your commercial real estate broker. Just to be clear, more leasing concessions that you get, the higher your face rent is going to be. So you may have less upfront costs, but you're going to have higher face rent and more long-term lease liability. Okay, let's move on. Next slide, please. Here again, one of the considerations that small businesses have is, how much space and for how long. Obviously, the ideal thing to do is to lease space for short periods of time with options to expand and all that. That's not always the best thing in the long run. It's really a very difficult decision. The more term that you sign up for, the longer your lease term is, the better your rent is going to be, the lower your rent is going to be, and the more concessions you're going to get, leasing concessions. Of course, on the other side, more term equals more risk. So that's a really delicate balance that you have to figure out. Similar with the notion of expansion, you also can negotiate for a right to extend the lease term for an additional period of time after your initial term is up. Maybe you have an initial term that is 8 years, and after that you have a right to extend for another 5 years. Those are very common. These days, we're also seeing in the market for longer term leases a right to terminate early. And the way that usually works is, let's say you have a lease for 10 years, maybe after 7 years, the landlord will give you the right to terminate, usually a one-time right to terminate, and in exchange for payment of a fee. The fee typically is basically the unamortized portion of all the landlord's leasing cost. So if you've got a 10-year lease and the landlord has incurred costs for free rent and allowances and brokerage commissions, if you amortize that over 10 years, so after 7 years, you've got just 3 more years of amortization of that. So that's what you would pay to the landlord, plus typically some number of months as an early termination fee. For retail leases, you sometimes also can negotiate kickouts based on a lack of gross sales. Similarly, if you do that, there's going to be some kind of an early termination fee involved, but it may be worth it to you to pay an early termination fee rather than be stuck in a location that doesn't work for you on a long-term basis. Okay, let's move to slide 7, please. Use. This is very important, particularly in the retail context, and we'll get to that in a minute, but may be important in the office context if you're doing something that's a little bit different than just general office space. For example, if you may have a nonprofit amongst the group here that maybe wants to operate a church from a space. You may not be able to get a certificate of occupancy to operate a church in the space that you want. So you need to know what the space is zoned for, and you need to make sure that you're able to secure a certificate of occupancy so you can operate your business from the space. With respect to other uses, general office use is generally not a problem. If you're going to be doing something other than general office use in office space, that gets a little bit dicier. For example, if there's going to be any assembling or manufacturing, things like that, space may or may not be zoned for that. So that's a whole different kettle of fish. But you do need to make sure that your use clause is broad enough to encompass what you're planning to do and how your business may grow. This is really critically important in connection with retail tenants. Some tenants may find that their business both grows and they end up getting into different areas that they weren't quite sure that they were going to grow into, just as a natural evolution of their business or a natural evolution of technology. So you need to make sure that the use clause is drafted broad enough to give you the ability to grow your business within reasonable parameters. The landlords, particularly in retail space, want to really box you in and have a very narrow use clause. They like what they see and they want your use, and they don't want anything different, at least today. And they're also very concerned because they've got other tenants in the space. They want to control the tenant mix in the shopping center, and other tenants may have the exclusive right to conduct a particular use. They want to make sure that you don't have a use that impinges or violates any of those use restrictions. Which comes again to the similar use of exclusives. If you have a particular business, maybe you're operating an Italian restaurant and you're going into a shopping center, you may want to try to get to be the exclusive Italian restaurant in that shopping center, so the landlord doesn't turn around and bring in someone that's a direct competitor with you. You may or may not be able to negotiate for that, but that is something that's important. Let's move a little bit to assignment and subletting. Jen, you want to hit some of those issues?
Sure. So the assignment portion of the lease.
Next slide, please.
Yes. The assignment portion of the lease affects your ability to get out of the space before the lease's termination and transfer it to another business, which is especially important post-pandemic with so many factors changing from week to week. There's two main types of transfers. A sublease involves you renting the space to a subtenant. The subtenant pays you, and then you in turn pay the landlord. And under this type of transfer, you remain liable. And then for an assignment, your rights and obligations as a tenant are transferred to a new tenant, and then the new tenant will directly pay the landlord. And while this has the potential for you to get out of your obligations under the lease, your lease may specify that even with an assignment, you still will remain liable until the expiration of the lease. Yeah,
typically you're in either an assignment or a subletting, the landlord's not going to let you off the hook. There may be a circumstance where if your net worth isn't so great and you're bringing the landlord someone that's really fabulous, that the landlord will let you off the hook. More often than not, that's not the case. But it is still an important vehicle, an important exit vehicle in case you either outgrow your space or it's not working, whatever. The ability to find an assignee or a subtenant to take over some or all of your space is very important. And you do want the landlord to act reasonably in that context. Usually the landlords want to keep very tight control over their space. They want sole exclusive discretion as to who's going to be taking their space. But there are sort of market standards of reasonability that the landlords will agree to.
Yes, and one other important point is that you may need to provide notice of a transfer to your landlord, even if you're allowed to provide a transfer without obtaining the landlord's consent. The lease may allow for certain types of permitted transfers, such as a straight up sale of your business, in which you essentially transfer your business to a similar operator with very few changes. But you still may need to provide notice that you are transferring to the landlord.
Yeah, it's really important. Even if the lease doesn't provide that, you should really try to negotiate for terms which allow you to bring in new partners, to merge, to sell your business without, the landlord really, having a whole lot of say in that, other than to know that it's that the new tenant is going to be creditworthy. There are all other. I think we're running a little short on time. There are a lot of other types of issues with assignment and subletting, including the landlord may have a right to recapture. The landlord is going to want to share in any profits that you may generate from a sublease. Very rare. And there are all kinds of related issues when you have lease assignments and guarantees, where you want to make sure that your transaction is structured in a way that the new tenant can't increase the obligations of the tenant or the guarantor without their consent. So let's move to slide 9. I think I want to talk a little bit about pass-throughs. Oh, wait a minute. Do we miss one? Into construction. Go one back, please. Yeah, there we go. Okay, we talked a little bit about this earlier. Utility costs, real estate costs, operating costs. These are all things that the landlord wants to pass through to the tenant on a pro rata basis. The real issue here is when it comes to operating cost or common area cost. The landlord really tries to fully load all of its cost of owning and operating the building into the operating expense bucket. But you really shouldn't be paying for all of those costs. There are market exclusions that most landlords will agree to in part to varying degrees. And these are very important and can really reduce the extent of your operating cost. Jen mentioned earlier that, for example, if the landlord incurs it's okay if the landlord incurs a cost to repair something and just passes a repair cost on, but if the landlord replaces an HVAC system for the building, incurred a multi-million-dollar cost, the tenant doesn't want to pay for that. So there are limits on capital expenses that you can negotiate. We call them permitted capital expenses, where the tenant really just pays for costs that are either to comply with new laws or for capital expenses that affect operating expense savings, and those types of things will be amortized over a period of time. But there are a whole host of exclusions from capital expenses that you want to include, and sometimes those can be very, very extensive. You want to make sure that there are no unreasonable fees. You want limits on the landlord's ability to pass through non-market management fees or other fees. There, again, lots of different things. I don't have time to go through them all, but this is really a very important lease term, and this is something that your brokers and particularly your attorneys can help you negotiate. Let's move to construction. We'll do a few items on construction, and then we'll kind of roll it on. Construction items, there are a couple of issues that you want to get through initially. Most deals these days are allowance deals, where the landlord's going to be providing an allowance for the tenant, and in most cases, the tenant is going to select a contractor to do the work itself. Occasionally, you'll find a situation where the landlord will agree to build out the tenant space on its own, either on its own nickel without a cap, or subject to a cap or an allowance. And where you do have an allowance and the landlord's doing the work, you really have to be very careful about how that work is priced so you get the benefit of the allowance. You want to make sure the landlord is bidding the work competitively, have an open book bidding system set up, lots of different controls that you can have to make sure that you get the bang for your buck. Again, you want to determine whether or not the landlord is doing the work for you. If it is, it's going to charge you additional fees for that work, or whether you're going to do it or engage a contractor to do it on your own. Typically, even in that situation, the landlord is going to want to charge some sort of a fee for monitoring your work. There may be landlord construction also. If you're leasing space, the landlord may be responsible to put it into what they call a shell condition. And the scope of the shell condition is critical. And your architect can advise you as to what that should include, whether it's VAV boxes, different types of features, demising walls, things like that. There are also a lot of issues when it comes to construction where the tenant could be paying additional amounts because the building or the floor is not up to code. And you're going to need to pay particular attention to making sure that the landlord is responsible for those types of things. We talked a little bit earlier about the landlord providing the allowance. It'll typically do that over time, as during the course of construction with a holdback. For a retail context, the landlord may not provide the allowance until after the work is done. It really just depends. And again, if you don't use all of your allowance, which is fairly infrequent these days as construction costs have gone up, you try to negotiate to take that unused portion and apply it against free rent. So last item I want to hit real quickly, I know is an item on people's minds. Let's turn to the last slide here, I think, is really what we're dealing with right now with COVID, the pandemic, and force majeure. People have tried to rely on the force majeure clause in the lease to get out of their lease obligations. Force majeure really is a concept of acts of God, unavoidable consequences, things outside of your control. And if the lease is drafted properly, it really provides that the non-monetary obligations of both the landlord and the tenant would be subject to deferral for events beyond the control of the parties. And that again should include a COVID situation. But typically, again, if the lease is drafted properly, a force majeure clause is not going to relieve the tenant from its obligation to pay the rent as and when it's due. There have been some cases, a number of bankruptcy cases and a few other cases where courts have stretched and granted rent relief on the basis of the force majeure clause. That's really not very typical, and we don't advise tenants to really rely on that as a basis for refusing to pay rent. You do need to look at that clause very carefully. There are any number of force majeure clauses that are drafted really poorly, and it may well be that you have a clause that might give you a basis for deferring rent. Putting that aside, you will need to negotiate with your landlord to see if the landlord will permit you to perhaps defer rent or abate rent for some period of time. Landlords don't want vacant space. It doesn't do them any good. Don't want to lose good tenants that under normal circumstances would be paying rent. So your landlords may be willing to work with you. It's a function of really how your business is doing, how much you're able to pay, and what the landlord's options are. But just kind of by way of example, for retail leases, we've seen situations where the landlord will defer rent for 90 days, 120 days, and then kind of amortize that rent over some period of time later in the lease term. So that's what we're seeing. There's really no market for it. You're not going to just walk in and say, we get that. Some landlords are refusing to grant any rent relief, particularly when they're first signing leases. So it's a little bit all over the board. And that's it. That's pretty much where we stand today. I know that doesn't answer all of your questions. Again, leases are long, complicated. They have lots of issues, and we're certainly here and happy to take questions. Danielle, any questions you wanted to bring to the group?
Yes, I sent you a few in your chat. Can you please address them?
Here, one question is, what types of businesses is percentage rent a good idea? So I guess that could mean, where do you typically see percentage rent?
Well, again, percentage rent is a retail concept, and when you say a good idea, the landlord, I'm not sure if the question is it a good idea to pay percentage rent in addition to your base rent, or to fight it, or is the question really more in this market where we don't know what we're doing, are we better off just paying percentage rent rather than base rent? There are some landlords that are where tenants are unable to fully operate due to restrictions. For example, if a restaurant can't have indoor seating but can just do takeout service, some landlords are requiring the tenant to pay either a reduced base rent and plus percentage rent. So we are seeing some of that.
Another question I'm seeing here, as far as use and certificates of occupancy, can a lease be crafted such that someone can be released from obligations if a license can't be obtained, such as a liquor license?
Yeah, sure. For a retail lease, it is not uncommon for there to be a contingency in the lease for the tenant to secure a liquor license. Sometimes there are even contingencies for building permits, but a liquor license contingency is fairly common for many restaurant leases. So if you don't get it, you may have the ability to terminate the lease, within some period of time. If you lose your liquor license during the term, that's going to be your problem. The landlord's never going to let you out of the lease once the lease commences. But if you can't get your liquor license within some period of time, the landlord won't. You may be able to negotiate a kick out.
We have a question here related to guarantees. Is there any type of insurance or other options available to tenants to help protect their personal assets when signing a lease that has a personal guarantee attached?
I've not. There are a lot of interesting insurance products that are around. I've not seen an insurance product that effectively, guarantees a lease obligation. So I don't think the insurance product is the way to go. There are certainly ways to protect personal assets, any number of ways of doing that. If you have property that is jointly held with a spouse, and you are the sole guarantor, and your spouse is not signing, then that property is going to be exempt from attack from a creditor while you are married and both alive. There you can put property into trust. There are any number of ways to shelter assets. But insurance products, nah, I'm not seeing anything like that.
And maybe this can be the last question here since we're at the hour. Are there any typical concessions for nonprofits?
It's really no different. If you're talking about an office lease, the landlord is going to provide market concessions. You may find a landlord that is favorably disposed and may be willing to give a nonprofit a better deal, just because that there's a desire to be a good neighbor. But generally speaking, landlords are, they have to pay their mortgage. They have joint venture partners. They're in it to make money. So, and particularly with the institutional landlords.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to the speakers or to us, and we can answer that question for you. Again, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jennifer, for the amazing discussion. I know we had so much to cover in such a short amount of time. So again, please reach out if you have any specific questions as it relates to commercial leasing. Again, thank you to our partners at the DC Bono Center, the Department of Small and Local Business Development, and the Anacostia Economic Development Corporation. Again, thank you to you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this chat. Next slide, please. So on August 30th, we will be releasing a crowdfunding toolkit in collaboration with the Department of Small and Local Business Development and the DC Women's Business Center. If you're interested in knowing how to crowdfund for your business, please feel free to register for this event. I will be dropping the link in the chat window shortly. So this concludes our DC Biz Chat. After the webinar, you will receive an email with the links to the recording in about 2 weeks or less. Feel free to reach out to any host organization if you have any questions about this session. In a few minutes, you'll be redirected to a survey, so please feel free to take it and fill it out. Your feedback is very important to us. Again, thank you to everyone and have a wonderful day.